Welcome, everybody. I'd like to start us off by respectfully acknowledging the island of Uktuhimguk, Newfoundland, as the unceded traditional territory of the Beothuk and the Mi'kmaq. We acknowledge Labrador as the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Inuit of Nitassinan, the Inuit of Nunatsiavut, and the Inuit of Nunavut. We recognize all First Peoples who were here before us, those who live with us now and the 7 generations to come. We strive to be responsible stewards of the land and to respect the cultures, ceremonies, and traditions of all who call it home. As we open our hearts and minds to the past, we commit ourselves to working in the spirit of truth and reconciliation to make a better future for all. Please note that it isn't enough to just do land acknowledgements without also taking action. Please take time to read the Truth and Reconciliation Calls to Action and the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Report, write letters to your MPs to action these calls, and donate to organizations that support residential school survivors and our Indigenous communities directly. And with that, welcome to Feminist Forum 4, Uplifting Women and Gender Diverse Leaders. We are beyond thankful to have almost 400 people registered for today's event. My name is Courtney Clark, my pronouns are she and her, and I will be one of your co-hosts today. I'm part of the leadership committee of Equal Voice NL, which is a multi-partisan nonprofit that works towards electing more women and gender diverse individuals into all levels of government. We're a small but mighty group of 4 community leaders delivering meaningful and accessible programs supporting engagement, mentorship, and training. We also advocate with and on behalf of women and gender diverse individuals who face more systemic barriers when seeking to run for office. So why are we here today? On the screen, you're going to see the images of some of our 26 participants who are currently going through our virtual campaign college. This 4-week program, supported by the Provincial Office for Women and Gender Equality, is diving into every aspect of political campaign life. With over 24 special guest panelists and a comprehensive toolkit, our participants are provided with the networks and support needed to confidently put their name on the ballot in the upcoming elections. But it's not enough for us to provide a campaign college with tactful advice and skills without addressing the real systemic barriers that exist in our society that keep people from putting their name on the ballot or from having the quality of life that they deserve. And at Equal Voice NL, we don't just advocate for women and gender diverse individuals, we advocate for women and gender diverse individuals of the BIPOC community, the LGBTQ2S+ community, the disabilities community, those who grew up rurally or in poverty, and more. So in partnership with Feminist Forum, get yourselves ready for 90 minutes of passionate, rapid-fire learning with 10 phenomenal women and gender-diverse leaders across Newfoundland and Labrador, as well as 2 guest panelists making an impact as far away as New Zealand and the United Kingdom. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. You can learn more about our panelists at feministforum.ca. The event is being recorded, has live closed captioning and ASL interpretation. Instructions were sent at the bottom of the email with the link, but comment in our chat box if you're struggling and we'll help you out. The event doesn't have live Q&A, but if you leave your input, collaboration ideas, or questions in the chat box, we'll personally get back to you after the event. As mentioned in our advertisements, the ticket revenues go back to the panelists or a cause of their choice as a thank you for their time and to support the continuation of their important work. On the Eventbrite registration page, you would have noticed Tip the Panelist section. If you are struck by the impact you hear about today and you want to further support these change makers, you can go back to that registration page at any time, even after the event ends, and tip the panelists. And finally, what's next? Well, the event is called Uplifting Women and Gender Diverse Leaders. Whether you look at the word uplifting as an adjective or a verb, that's totally up to you. But we're not here today to talk about feel-good stories, pat each other on the back, and then move on with life. We want to launch some real sustainable change in our communities. And it's not enough just to talk about the injustices in our community, we also need to take action. So while this event ends in 90 minutes, the work still continues. The information of this event will be turned into a formal report that'll be expanded upon, released to the public, and put into the hands of relevant governmental leaders at all levels. We will ensure to get a response, and we will follow up through with all possible collaborations. And with that, I'm going to pass the event over to your moderator and the co-founder of Feminist Forum, Dr. Betsy McGregor.
Welcome to Feminist Forum 4. Soyez les bienvenus, Anine. My name is Dr. Betsy McGregor. I use the personal pronouns she, her, and elle. I'm speaking to you from the Kawartha Lakes in Ontario, traditional territory of the Mississauga First Nation. On the screen is the moving artwork of Gail Sinclair, next to the reports of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada and the Reclaiming Power and Place report of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Any pandemic recovery plan must address acts of reconciliation, enable decolonization, and ensure Indigenous voice and vision in defining our future. Now, a glance to our feminist history. The Sankofa bird mentions the importance of turning our heads backwards to pluck the wisdom from the past before striding forwards. And on screen is the sweep of the United Nations meetings propelling the global agenda for girls, women, and persons of gender diverse identity, from Beijing on the left, 1995, through to the Sustainable Development Goals 2030 on the right. Visit feministforum.ca for the full documentation of these declarations and platforms for action. Feel the energy? Some 30,000 of us were in Beijing in 1995. We sang, we danced, we lobbied, and we gave workshops. It was thrilling to lay the foundation for the 1995 platform for action. On the left of the screen, I led the delegation of the World Women's Veterinary Medical Association, which I founded. We all went championing women's rights, but we left championing human rights to the iconic words center screen of Hillary Clinton at the podium: women's rights are human rights and human rights are women's rights once and for all. Now, we flew home respectively to our countries, and in Canada, a short glance at our own political landscape. Here is the portrait of Canada's Fathers of Confederation, 1867. It hangs in center block, and beneath it, most MPs are sworn into power. Notice anyone missing? Well, there are three watershed movements that have marked our progress. On the left of your screen, those who went to the courts, the famous five, the feisty Albertans, who contested that women should be recognized as persons under the Canadian Constitution. How audacious is that? The case was won after an appeal to the British Privy Council by October 18th, 1929. And at center screen, we also went to the streets, but it took until 1960 federally for the franchise to be universal in our nation. And as recently as 2017, the third watershed moment, which was an amendment through Bill C-16 to amend the Human Rights Act and the Criminal Code, adding gender expression and gender identity as protected grounds. Now, historically, it was not until the 1990s when women and gender diverse individuals were elected to be first ministers, 1 prime minister and 12 premiers. In 2013, a high watermark was marked when 6 of these persons led their provinces, and some 86% of Canadians were led by women and individuals of diverse backgrounds. But 6 years later, by 2019, there were none. So lesson learned is that ground game can be lost, and we need to continue to equip, empower, and inspire women and gender diverse individuals to put their names on the ballot. Now, is parity in politics all about quotas? Certainly not. It's more than just numbers, it's impact, and it's insight, better representation, better process, better policy. It's good governance. Equal Voice, co-host of Feminist Forum, delivers a unique event in our nation, bringing 338 women to take their seats in the Parliament. What a vision. Seen here are more women and persons of diverse expression in the House of Commons than there have ever been in the history of our nation. Visit equalvoice.ca and be inspired. Our stories need to be told. See feministforum.ca for a rich array of books and resources. And on screen is Kate Graham's No Second Chances and colleague Holly and Paul's Invisible Rules of the Corporate Boardroom and Women on the Ballot. the powerful stories of telling the powerful stories of 95 women in our nation, from 23 years old on your screen to 93, all party lines at all levels of governance, and including 19 women in this book who ran to lead their political parties and 49 firsts, including on the top line there, Morgane Auger, first transgender person to run for an official political party in our nation. We need to see and hear the trailblazers' stories. Now, the global COVID pandemic is telling us another story of women and gender diverse leaders. We see here healthcare workers, personalities on our television sets daily, frontline workers, and the scientists, such as the one at the bottom, Dr. Corbett, a leading scientist for the Moderna vaccine laboratory, women volunteers, women truckers, women homeschooling. We need to see them in order to count them in and design for them. Now, at Harvard Medical School, I led a 2-year as senior research fellow, a 2-year global think tank of ethicists, surgeons, NGOs, jurists, and the World Health Organization, addressing pandemic and public policy. Essentially, on the next slide, it boils down into 3 questions: who risks, who benefits, and who decides. Seemingly simple, but foundational to any pandemic response. So first question, who risks? Well, who do we see? Who are we counting? On the slide is 22-year-old Dr. Marilyn Waring, goat farmer and first female finance minister in New Zealand, founder of Feminist Economics. Her books are iconic, and this one introduced by Gloria Steinem. On the right are those kinds of things that she saw missing in the gross domestic product measurements, and she called upon nations to count differently. And counting differently involves seeing how COVID is hitting people differently. Next slide. COVID is being fought on 2 different levels, codes, if you wish. The genetic code, we're used to counting that. Vaccines, testing, tracking. We're not so used to counting and seeing and designing for postal code issues of a pandemic. Gender, diversity, housing, education. We need to see people and count them in. You can't make policy for people you don't see. Now, the World YWCA iceberg infographic illustrates unseen realities during the COVID. And the Canadian YWCA Shadow Pandemic infographic does the same, revealing the hidden horror of abuse and violence against women and gender diverse individuals. And wonderfully, the new design that results, the Canadian YWCA has produced the first ever feminist economic recovery plan for the nation, designing differently because we're counting differently. Now, designing differently also means that we take account of the concept One Health. The timeline of the history of pandemics demonstrates that COVID is but the newest in the neighborhood of pandemics, transmitted like a zoonotic from animals to humans. So designing means One Health concept, environment, humans, and animals. And lead differently? You bet. Within months of the pandemic outbreak, next slide, that the Harvard Business Review published an article, Will the Pandemic Change Our View of Women's Leadership? Indeed. And on the right, one of the speakers in today's Feminist Forum will reveal the results of her academic study, Does Gender Matter? In a study of the first 4 months of COVID deaths and COVID outbreaks in 200 nations. Was there a difference in how nations were led? Count differently, design differently, lead differently. We have just the panel to guide us. So let's get busy resetting normal. And please welcome to the screen our first panel, the impact of COVID on women and individuals of diverse background. From the other side of the world, New Zealand, and by the way, a global pace setter in how they measure GDP or a nation's well-being. They measure natural capital, social capital, human capital, and financial capital. So do check out the Treasury New Zealand Living Standards Framework. But Now for Dr. Nicola Ngawati, lawyer, a former person with the New Zealand Diplomatic Corps, and working extensively now at the interface between the Crown and Maori relationship in the public sector. We're thrilled to have you. Welcome to the screen, Dr. Nicola Ngawati.
O kia ora, i ngā mana, i ngā reo, i ngā karangamaha, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. I'm greeting you, Dr. McGregor, and all the panelists in our Indigenous language of New Zealand, which is Māori. Of course, I feel right at home with the pictures of Marilyn Waring and our Prime Minister on the screen earlier. Warm greetings to you all, and a special acknowledgement to all the Indigenous people who are here today, either on the panel or listening. As Betsy said, I work at the Manatu Wahine, the Ministry for Women in New Zealand. I lead the team that's coordinating our government response to a reconciliation process in our Waitangi Tribunal to do with the rights of Māori women. But today I'm going to be touching on some of the specific impacts of COVID on our Indigenous women and girls. I could switch to the second screen slide. So what do I mean by Indigenous? I mean Māori, our Indigenous tangata whenua, or the people of the land, wahine, or women in New Zealand. We are diverse in the expression of our lived realities. We are mothers, sisters, daughters, or learned kuia, or elders. We are called the whare tangata, or the holders of life, as it is through us that all generations are born. We are working across all aspects of society. We succeed in pockets. You may have heard recently the government announced the first ever wahine Māori to be our next Governor General, Dame Cindy Kiro. But sadly, we are also represented in many what are called misery statistics. We are overrepresented in the prisons. We have higher rates of cancer, housing poverty, low incomes. We attain lower levels of education. And we know that over this time of COVID, Māori women have experienced the greater impact of the pandemic because the existing differences we already sustain have been exacerbated, which has led to more inequalities. We know this is especially the case in the employment area, with the predominance of wahine Māori in some of the lower skilled work areas. We were some of the first to lose our jobs. So it's been a difficult time in Aotearoa, New Zealand. If I could turn to slide 3, I just wanted to mention one of the unique responses the New Zealand government brought to the table was to have a community fund to respond to a number of the women's organisations in New Zealand who really struggled during COVID to find enough money to support women and girls in the community. So basically, this was a response because women's needs weren't being met by the core funding packages. So women could apply for a one-off grant to help their organisation to still be able to deliver services out in the community through COVID. I've given you a few examples here, the wonderful photo of the young girls from Taitokoro or in the Northland, which enabled those young women of Māori descent to be able to hold traditional wānanga or meetings to promote their own health and well-being using traditional Māori methodologies and cultural practices, all part of building their resilience to COVID, and also, of course, the wider discrimination and social inequities they continue to face in their daily reality. Next slide, please. There's a couple of other funding examples. I love the photo and the joy on the left. This is another group of our rangatahi wahine, or young women in the South Island, who were also able to receive funding to promote positive life experiences for young women to learn interrelationship skills, to build their self-esteem, which is so important when we know that Indigenous communities are also suffering higher rates of mental health issues, addiction, and suicide rates. The last one is a group of slightly older wahine who were able to run their own tikanga program, which is a cultural safe learning space where we can pass on our cultural knowledge to each other to build our cultural identity to make us all stronger. So those are some examples of the slides.
Thank you, Nicola.
Thank you.
I'm thrilled that New Zealand has kicked off our panel. Merci infiniment. And now to Dr. Chunyan Su. Chunyan came to Canada from Shanghai, China in 2007, academic advisor at Memorial University, and impacting the lives of thousands of students as the International Student Coordinator. Welcome to the screen, Chunyan.
Hello, everyone. My name is Chunyan Zhu. I work in the Academic Advising Center as an academic advisor at Memorial University. I came to Newfoundland in 2007, and I've been living here for 14 years. I'm a mother of 3 children. All my children were born in Newfoundland. Today, I'm going to share my experience and perspectives towards how COVID impacts on my life as a member in the Chinese community here. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry. Keep that slide. Look at these 3 pictures. The left one was taken in the Chinese New Year in 2019. That represents our past normal. The right 2 pictures were taken just 1 week before the 2020 Chinese New Year. Our boys were practicing Chinese Kung Fu and the girls were practicing a traditional Chinese dance for the New Year celebration. Everyone involved was working so hard. We had been practicing for almost 4 months until we were notified just a couple of days before before the celebration that all the events would be canceled due to the COVID outbreak in China. Everybody was extremely disappointed, but we understood the situation. Next slide, please. At that time, we didn't realize that much worse situation was waiting for us. COVID had brought increased incidents of racism, discrimination, and violence against Asians. To help prevent a potential spread of the virus and the rise of discrimination, to build a good reputation, people in the Chinese community here in Newfoundland made calls for self-quarantine to those returning Chinese students and the workers, even before the global pandemic started. In order to encourage people to volunteer to self-quarantine, one of the group members offered his several rental apartments for free to those who wished to self-quarantine. We spontaneously formed a volunteer group to help people in quarantine purchase groceries and supplies and deliver things to them. So these are 3 screenshots from our WeChat volunteer group. They represent the very common conversation regarding different levels of assistance people offered at that time. Next slide, please. So are things getting better? This is a national report combining the community-based tracking data from various legit sources. From this report, over 600 anti-Asian racism incidents reported since onset of COVID-19 in Canada. Women are impacted the most, reporting 60% of all incidents. Newfoundland occupied a small percentage of the reported incidents. And we heard a number of incidents like anti-Asian racism incidents from our Chinese students and Asian employees, which brought up lots of concerns in the Chinese community in Newfoundland. People working with the international students also wonder why our Chinese students are much less engaging than other groups of students. we are unsure if there was a trust issue behind it due to COVID and the rising cases of anti-Asian racism. Next slide, please. I have to say that I also saw positive part from 2020 and 2021, which working together made us a strong community. People understand each other, share the same concerns, offer help to others, fight racism together. That's something I've never seen before. So this picture shows a group of women volunteers in the Newfoundland Chinese community. Unlike many other Chinese communities in the big cities, the population of the Chinese descent in Newfoundland is quite small. Therefore, people don't have opportunities to be often exposed to the Chinese culture. In this context, women, mostly moms, play a significant role in language and cultural heritage to our next generation, which cannot be obtained from the dominant culture. These mom volunteers worked very hard trying to build a strong community where our children and others can be exposed to the Chinese language and culture. Most of them also volunteered in the quarantine help group to help build a good reputation of our community. Thank you.
Chunyan, thank you so very much. And Nicola, thanks from the other side of the planet, getting up so early and inspiring us. And now our third speaker, Ledon Wellon. Ledon started Faces of Fertility in 2020 to advance for reproductive health care, the access that we all have. Ledon, to you.
Hi, I'm Ledon Wellon. I'm 31 years old, and I'm one of 4.5 million Canadians who have experienced infertility. I'm also one of the 1 in 4 women who have experienced a miscarriage. I've been dealing with this since 2016 and have spent over $30,000 on medical bills directly associated with trying to conceive. Did you know that the costs associated with infertility are not covered by our government's healthcare? That the average cost of an IVF cycle is around $20,000 if you can do it within your own province? In addition to our government not counting this medical diagnosis as healthcare important enough to be covered, what is also shocking is that most major insurance companies offer little to no coverage for any medications associated with infertility, leaving the burden of dealing with a heartbreaking diagnosis an impossible feat to overcome financially, unjustly leaving millions of people without options to have a child of their own. The mental health impact of people struggling with infertility has been compared to that of a patient living with a cancer diagnosis in a study by Harvard University. People are left scarred, traumatized, heartbroken, and often tens of thousands of dollars in debt with no guarantee of bringing home a child. Infertility is often joked about, ignored, or thought of as a fun option because IVF and other fertility treatments are often glamorized on TV. Next slide, please. Before experiencing this myself, I never knew how disadvantaged Newfoundlanders and Labradorians were compared to the rest of Canada. It's only us and PEI that don't have access to a clinic within our own province, and we are the only province without either access or government funding to help with the extreme costs associated with the diagnosis. This is not only a provincial issue, but a federal government issue as well. There needs to be a government guidance and funding to make sure that all Canadians have equal access to the treatment they need in their own provinces, without having childbearing a privilege for the wealthy. It shouldn't be the burden of infertile people to make sure that the government treats us equally in healthcare. We need other people to acknowledge the inequalities that we are trying to overcome. The blatant inequality has been amplified throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. Thousands of women have had an extraordinary amount of extra stress added to an already difficult journey, with clinic closures, canceled cycles, and travel restrictions within our country. I never knew how absolutely inaccessible our reproductive health care was until I had women from all over the province reaching out, asking me what they could do, since they'd already taken thousands of dollars worth of medications right before lockdowns, which meant their medications, the toll on their body, and the time taken from the beginning steps of the treatment were all gone to waste. How are they now supposed to afford an extra 4 weeks off of work to travel and isolate here and as well as the place that they were getting their treatment? Were they just supposed to give up on the hopes of having a child this year? Next slide, please. I too was caught during treatment with COVID shutdowns. I went to Calgary, Alberta, and in March for IVF, days before the first cases in North America. I had traveled so far because I had family to stay with and I needed to save the money of hotels and car rentals to make this possible for me. Every morning I'd go to my clinic and be told, we'll continue for today, but we have no idea if we're going to be open tomorrow. Thankfully, I was able to complete my cycle, but the added stress could have been the reason that it didn't work for me. I had to return home again without being pregnant and with no idea of when I would be able to return to the embryos that I had waiting for me in Calgary. Clinics opened sporadically across Canada, with Newfoundland and Labradors being the last, and resuming practice only after the opening of our malls. It became clear that the healthcare system and the government did not see our extremely time-sensitive issues as a priority, even though many other places around the world had deemed it an essential service. We were promised that we wouldn't be shut down again, but in February, even after a news briefing stating that we would remain open, they shut their doors for the second time. We had been lied to, our emotions played with, and the opening the second time only after being publicly called out for the inequality and mistreatment of the infertile community. This could have been avoided if anyone had listened to the pained cries of the people who have fought before me. If we had access to a clinic in Newfoundland and Labrador, if insurance companies and healthcare deemed it important enough to help those of us who are struggling, if people took what society deemed as a women's only medical problem and included it with other essential healthcare, maybe then we could have a thriving population. Maybe then we could have less young people with mental health issues, and maybe then we could have more happy and complete families living in this beautiful province. Thank you.
Ledon, thank you so very much, Ledon. And now we pass the virtual screen to Kate Cadigan. One opening comment: in 2019, she was given a ticket to hear Barack Obama speak about civic responsibility and the privilege of democracy. And that sparked her remarkable passion and action as a leader protecting democracy. Kate, over to you.
Hello, everyone. I'd first like to begin by thanking Equal Voice and Feminist Forum for the incredible opportunity to speak to you today. As a young person living through these abnormal times, I hope to shed some light on some of the issues we are facing due to the COVID-19 pandemic. As a young person, I have seen the effects of COVID-19 on my peers, and I'm aware of the many struggles we have had to face in the last 15 months. Although we are a strong, resilient generation, this virus has changed our lives forever. As I thought of ways that my life has changed since March 2020, it was difficult to think of an aspect of my life that was left untouched. Although I am lucky to live in a very safe province where COVID-19 has been relatively kind to us, there's still so many ways in which it has changed my world. I can no longer participate in extracurricular activities in the same way in which I would have a year ago, and I used to be in many. There have been adjustments made to my schooling life to accommodate the virus, and the ways in which I socialize have drastically changed. Every opportunity we would have had to meet new people has disappeared. For many young people who already struggle with mental health issues, this changed world is a massive hurdle. Next slide, please. While I understand it's important to protect our loved ones and ourselves, it impacts our young people's mental health. Last summer, my cousin had a life-threatening mental health crisis. Although she might have already had pre-existing challenges, the coronavirus pandemic accelerated and amplified her struggle. These type of mental health emergencies are happening everywhere around us, especially among young people. Without face-to-face interaction, it is difficult to identify those who are hurting. Without the support of extracurricular activities and with the disruption to schools, the informal support systems for young people are dwindling. UNICEF says that this leads that young women are reporting a significantly higher rate of anxiety and depression. Although not all these young women might be in crisis, it is important to offer resources before their condition worsens. Before the pandemic, Canada was already facing a mental health predicament, and without enough support for young people, we are only digging ourselves a deeper hole. Young women are feeling less hopeful about the future, and this feeling will change the ways in which we shape our lives, and it will inevitably change the future of our province and country. Young people especially must stay hopeful for what's on the horizon. One major issue that has come to light since the beginning of the pandemic is the presence of online predators. As we are home far more often than we have ever been and are lacking face-to-face interaction with our peers, we are spending much more time online. UNICEF says that this leads to heightened risks of youth taking sexualized photos. Children are more likely to find themselves in these positions when experiencing poor psychological health, low self-esteem, and feelings of loneliness. All these emotions have increased since the start of the pandemic, leading young people, especially young girls, into these situations. These encounters can have dramatic effects on our mental health. Psychological suffering, self-harm, suicidal behavior, internalized self-loathing, and impaired relationships are all potential effects that online exploitation can have on girls. Next slide, please. Eating disorders such as anorexia, bulimia, and binge eating disorders have all increased since the start of the pandemic. Personally, I have noticed the pressure of maintaining a certain appearance during this worldwide crisis, especially among my friends. For many women, it is easy to focus on their imperfections while looking at themselves on the screen. This digital world is leading them to compensate by unhealthy weight loss methods. For others, being at home means no exercise and access to food all the time, contributing to overeating and binge eating. The mix of uncertainty from the pandemic, puberty, increased engagement on social media, and a disrupted routine create the perfect storm for developing an eating disorder. With higher online presence, young people are exposed to the perfect life of online influencers, leading them to believe the false reality that they present and causing young people to take drastic measures to fit in. This is not a sustainable lifestyle and will have long-term effects on us. All these things that I've briefly touched on affect the day-to-day lives of our youth. We have all lost so much. Even those who are not experiencing mental health issues or illness are still struggling with our new normal. As young people, we've got to stick together and watch out for one another and lead with kindness. With the love, support, and help from those around us, we will get through this and be strong leaders. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate, so much. And now Ophelia Ravencroft. Ophelia, non-binary lesbian woman and activist in local fights for sex worker, queer, trans rights. Her PhD research, fascinating ethnomusicology at Memorial University, studies gender equality in the St. John's heavy metal community. Ophelia, welcome to the virtual screen.
Dr. McGregor, I think your enthusiasm for my research is possibly even greater than my own. So I appreciate that. Thank you for the introduction. My name is Ophelia Ravencroft. My pronouns are the sound of radio dial tuning, trying to find a station. And I don't have any slides, so you'll have to put up with my Ferris Bueller kind of run, and I'll do my best to be entertaining. In trying to work out a topic for today, my initial plan was to touch on trans issues as they're related to this pandemic, and to talk about the ways that lockdown, for instance, has served as a catalyst for a lot of folks to engage in some gender exploration and discover things about themselves. But I would feel remiss if I didn't take the opportunity to discuss the way that COVID has impacted sex workers in Canada. This is an issue across the globe, of course, but I can speak to it predominantly from a national perspective as well as from a local one. I've been involved in the fight for sex worker rights for a number of years, both publicly and privately, and it's something I'm happy to touch on now. For those who are not overly familiar with the system that we have in Canada, we've implemented a variation on the Nordic model of sex work legislation in Canada, which holds that the selling of services is not illegal, but the buying of it is. And within the framework that we've established, it's really quite difficult. It's a very small needle that you have to thread to engage in this work without in one way or another breaking one law or another, around advertising, around solicitation in certain ways, around where you're working, when you're working, how, and so on, which has left a lot of workers in Canada feeling, of course, quite vulnerable, which is regrettably the inevitable condition of sex work in the way that we currently treat it. COVID has amplified that as it has amplified most inequalities in our society. The reality of the situation is that because of this legal framework, many sex workers are scared to come forward, scared to declare their income on their taxes, which, the CRA are administrators of the Income Tax Act. They are not a criminal enforcement agency. At the end of the day, they are looking to make sure that you pay your fair share of taxes under the law. So there are some workers who will feel comfortable doing that, but because of the legal ramifications, which potentially could result, many do not, or at least the fear of those legal ramifications. When the Canadian government introduced the CERB back last April, the income testing requirement on CERB, the minimum of $5,000, meant that anybody who hadn't made that much, of course, wasn't eligible. But if you were a sex worker who was nervous to declare your income on your taxes, you automatically didn't qualify if you hadn't listed that there, meaning you were stuck between a rock and a hard place. The industry has slowed down in much of the country. Here in Newfoundland, in speaking to workers, both in massage parlors and strip clubs and so on locally, we are aware that the damage to our local industry has been a little bit more minimal perhaps than it has elsewhere because of the stability of the COVID situation in Newfoundland. But elsewhere in Canada, we're aware that some businesses have closed. Workers have found that clients are simply unwilling to come out owing to the danger, the risk that they're taking in buying services right now, which has made it, it's made it extremely economically vulnerable for workers who are already facing more than enough vulnerability, stigma, judgment, and attack as it is. What this has led to is an increased pressure on the client side for workers to knock their rates down, to provide discounts, to do, we're now hearing reports from across the country, from Ontario in particular, as well as other places, that for outdoor workers who are already by far the most vulnerable sex workers, that a service that previously might have cost $100 or $200, a client will now say, well, it's going to be $50, take it or leave it. I know you don't have another source of income. Because sex workers have been marginalized in the ways that they have for so long, it's made many unable to access the benefits which are presently available. It's forced them to continue to work in unsafe and increasingly illegal conditions. There are requirements between the provinces around things like PPE, masks, and so on, which have just taken that needle that sex workers need to thread and made it even smaller. All of those things put together have made this an exceptionally vulnerable time for sex workers. The reality of this is, and we know this from experience, any time that you place further restrictions on sex workers and any time that you take that eye of the needle and make it even smaller, it puts more power in the hands of clients. It drives workers underground. It makes them even more vulnerable. This is not anybody's intention, obviously, in dealing with issues with COVID, but we are aware that it has worsened those inequalities quite considerably. In the going forward, I think this is a particularly essential time for us to be talking about decriminalization, but we'll come around to that when we talk policy a little bit later. But be aware that as harsh as COVID has been on everyone, the impact on sex workers, on their finances, on their safety, their stability, and their ability to conduct themselves in their profession in a free and safe way, the impact has been quite severe.
Ophelia, we need a full panel for each one of you. Thank you very much for bringing our attention to your activism. And our final speaker on the panel, we turn to Sandra McKellar. Sandra, Executive Director of Newfoundland's Sexual Assault and Crisis Prevention Center, and many more things. Visit feminist.ca for her bio. Sandra, welcome to the screen. Oh, Sandra, could you unmute yourself? Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Ophelia, for your presentation. Welcome, Sandra.
Thank you. I would like to thank